January 28, 1944, 05:17 a.m., northwest of Ortona, Italy. The fog rolled low over the ridges like slow-moving artillery smoke, and the first pale thread of dawn had not yet broken through the winter sky when Corporal Alan Mercer stepped out of the shallow dugout where he had spent the night. The air smelled of damp earth, cordite and pine needles crushed under boots. Somewhere behind him a mule brayed weakly, its breath rising in clouds. Ahead of him, barely visible through the drifting haze, lay the shredded edges of the German defensive line. Mercer adjusted the strap of his rifle, felt the stiffness in his fingers, and exhaled a slow plume of white vapor that rose like a ghost above his lips. He had no idea that before the day was over, his name would become tied to a kind of Canadian ammunition that German gunners had mocked for months. At that moment, he was just another thin silhouette in a cold and indifferent landscape, waiting for orders, waiting for the world to move. The ridge around him felt like a frozen amphitheater. Every small sound, a boot scraping stone, a rifle sling creaking, a distant cough, echoed in the stillness. Behind the front line, buried under camouflage netting and tar-stained canvas, a group of engineers worked on crates stenciled with red maple leaves and fading black serial numbers. Their breath came out in white spurts as they pried open lids and inspected the dull brass casings stacked like cheap jewelry. These were the rounds that German gunners had ridiculed in their intercepted communications. Canadian bargain shells, they had written. Soft metal, poor integrity, laughable. And yet this shipment had been rushed in secret across the Adriatic after a quiet test showed something no one expected. Under certain temperatures and barrel conditions, the softened alloy acted unpredictably, and sometimes devastatingly. But Mercer and the infantrymen knew nothing of that. They only sensed something was different by the tension in the voices of the engineers, the way officers spoke in clipped sentences, and kept glancing toward the distant rumble of tank engines moving like slumbering giants beyond the fog. At 05:23, the first German shell cracked open the morning. It tore through the sky like a metal scream, obliterating a patch of frozen earth 10 meters from Mercer's position. The concussion slapped the breath from his lungs. He dove instinctively into the mud, felt the cold ground vibrate beneath him as more shells followed, a staccato rhythm of destruction marking the edge of the ridge. The fog lit up with bursts of orange light. Soil rained down in gritty cascades. Someone yelled for cover. Someone else was already praying. Mercer pushed himself up, heart hammering like a piston. Through the veil of smoke, he saw the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank crawling forward on the opposite slope. Its hull cut through the fog like the prow of a battleship, its armor plates wet with condensed mist. The tank moved with a terrible confidence, a predator certain of its place at the top of the food chain. Behind it, a second Tiger advanced, then a third. Their engines growled with a deep animal resonance. The Canadian anti-tank crew scrambled to position their 6-pounder gun. Frost-covered hands fumbled at latches. Corporal Mercer instinctively moved to help, though he wasn't part of that crew. He planted his boots in the slick mud, shoulder to shoulder with the men hauling the weapon into alignment. The fog swirled around them like battlefield theater smoke. Somewhere behind their position, the engineers were shouting for the ammunition crates. The Tigers advanced methodically, crushing stones, branches, and dirt beneath their treads. The ground trembled as if bowing under their weight. Mercer felt the tremor in his calves. The fog thickened around the tanks, shrouding them in a pale, ghostly glow. The gunner, a freckled boy named Thompson who still carried a postcard from home tucked inside his helmet liner, dropped into firing position. His breath fogged up the sight. He wiped it with a sleeve already crusted with frost and mud. The loader, McKinley, tore open a crate with a bayonet and extracted one of the rounds, a Canadian alloy shell with a dull sheen that made it look unimpressive, almost crude. He didn't have time to question it. He rammed it into the breech, locked it in place, and stepped back. "Target, lead Tiger," Thompson whispered, though the roar of tank engines swallowed the sound. The first shot cracked through the morning like a whip. The recoil punched the ground, kicking up a spray of frozen dirt. The shell streaked across the slope, vanished into the fog, and then an instant later there was a flash. Not a clean penetration, not a ricochet. Something in between. A strange bursting flare that bloomed against the Tiger's front plate. The crew blinked. Mercer narrowed his eyes. The Tiger shuddered. Its steady growl faltered for half a heartbeat. A plume of smoke coughed from a seam along its glacis. The tank slowed, treads grinding unevenly. "Load another," the sergeant barked. McKinley shoved another round into place. Thompson fired again. This time the shell struck lower, glancing off mud-spattered armor, and instead of ricocheting harmlessly, it detonated unevenly, sending a spray of molten fragments sideways into a vulnerable joint near the tank's suspension. The Tiger lurched, one tread locking abruptly with a violent metallic snap. Its hull twisted, angling awkwardly. A third shot followed. It hit near the turret ring. Another strange, irregular detonation rippled across the metal. A blistering burst that didn't punch through in a traditional sense but forced heated fragments into microscopic seams. And then, impossibly, the Tiger stopped entirely. Its turret froze mid-rotation. Steam hissed from vents. The tank went still. A wounded giant immobilized by ammunition the German crews had laughed at only days before. For a moment, no one moved. Even the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Then the second Tiger advanced, more cautious now, its gun sweeping the ridge. Thompson whispered something under his breath, a prayer or a curse, and loaded again. The engineers watched from behind cover, eyes wide, realizing that the unpredictable metallurgical flaw they'd spent weeks arguing about was turning into something else entirely. Mercer felt the shift in the air, the fog, the cold, the fear. Everything tightened around them, drawing the moment into sharp focus. The second Tiger fired. The shell screamed overhead, tearing branches from pines behind the ridge. Thompson fired back. The Canadian round struck the Tiger's side armor and detonated in a warped, blistering flash. The tank groaned like metal bending under an invisible hammer. Its tread spasmed, its engine sputtered. And suddenly, unbelievably, the second Tiger began to smoke. In the span of a minute, the battlefield had changed shape. Cheap ammo, they had said. Laughable. Soft metal. And yet, on this frozen hillside, at the edge of a nameless ridge in Italy, Corporal Alan Mercer watched those shells break the mechanical pride of the German armored corps. What no one understood yet, not the infantrymen, not the engineers, not the officers shouting orders through the fog, was that this was only the beginning of the day the Germans would later describe with a single bitter phrase, the Canadian alloy malfunction. But here, in the cold dawn, all Mercer felt was the tremble of the earth and the distant hiss of a wounded Tiger tank dying in the fog. The fog didn't lift after the first two Tigers fell silent. Instead, it thickened, flowing across the ridgeline in long, cold ribbons that blurred the world into a palette of gray and silver. The smell of burning oil seeped through the haze, drifting from the crippled tanks like the scent of a forge left unattended. Corporal Alan Mercer felt it on the back of his tongue, metallic and acrid, a taste that made the cold feel sharper. The ground under his boots trembled with the distant rumble of yet more German armor advancing along the valley floor. Somewhere to the south, a machine gun nest had begun to fire in erratic bursts, the sound ricocheting between the slopes like trapped thunder. No one spoke. The silence was not peace. It was the breath between blows. In a shallow depression behind the gun, the Canadian engineers crouched over the opened crates, their fingers tracing the rims of the remaining shells, as if searching for an explanation hidden in the metal itself. Lieutenant Rowe, his glasses fogged and his gloves stiff with frost, turned one of the rounds in his hand, bringing it close to his ear as though expecting it to whisper its secret. The dull sheen of the alloy caught what little light seeped through the mist. It didn't look extraordinary. It didn't feel extraordinary. But something inside it behaved differently when struck at high velocity. Something no manual had predicted and no German officer had imagined. Thompson wiped sweat from his eyebrows despite the cold. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the ferocity of the recoil he'd absorbed in such quick succession. McKinley rechecked the crates, counting fast, his breath choppy. Their sergeant, a broad man named Forrest with mud caked up to his knees, scanned the slope with narrowed eyes, waiting for movement. It came in the form of a low, distant growl. Not one tank, several. Mercer felt the sound before he heard it clearly. A slow, steady vibration under the soles of his boots. He looked toward the fog-choked valley. Shapes shifted in the mist, hulking shadows gliding forward with patient inevitability. The guttural churn of their engines mixed with the rhythmic clatter of treads crushing frozen soil. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of German engineering moving with grim purpose. 3, no, 4, Thompson muttered. 5, McKinley corrected. His voice was thin. 5 Tigers. Or at least 5 heavy shapes moving like tigers. The fog hid the details, but not the weight of their presence. Forrest steadied himself. Positions. The word carried more strength than volume. It pushed every man back to motion. The 6-pounder gun locked into place. The engineers dragged more crates forward. Mercer tightened the strap of his rifle, though he knew it would be as useless as throwing snow at a locomotive. His place, for now, was alongside the men serving the gun, lifting, helping, bracing the equipment when recoil threatened to drag it backward through the muck. The first of the approaching Tigers fired blind. The muzzle flash was barely visible through the fog, but the scream of the shell was unmistakable. A ripping, violent tear in the sky that made every man flinch. It slammed into the slope behind the Canadian line, blasting up a storm of dirt, roots, and shattered stone. A shower of debris rained down on them, pattering against helmets and webbing. Mercer spat mud from his lips and ducked instinctively as a second round shrieked overhead. Thompson swore under his breath. Forrest slammed his fist against the gun shield. Hold steady. Let them come. The fog played tricks, shifting shapes and distances. The Tigers advanced slowly, towers in the mist, each foot of forward motion accompanied by the grinding crunch of treads and the occasional metallic hiss as the tanks adjusted elevation. Then, through a break in the haze, the lead Tiger appeared, its massive turret emerging like a dark moon rising. The front plate glistened with dew. Its machine gun slit yawned open like a cold, unblinking eye. "Load!" Forrest barked. McKinley shoved another Canadian alloy round into the breech. Thompson braced himself, fingers curled tight around the grips. The moment stretched, suspended in the frigid air. Then Thompson fired. The shell streaked into the fog and struck the Tiger with a strange warping flare. Instead of the neat, ringing impact typical of standard munitions, the alloy detonated with an uneven, blistering pulse. A wash of heated fragments rippled across the armor like sparks thrown from a blacksmith's hammer, crawling along the seams where plates met. The tank groaned, its forward motion stalling for a heartbeat. A second shot followed almost immediately. The shell hit the Tiger's lower front plate and detonated in another warped bloom, sending shrapnel scything sideways. One fragment lodged deep into a tension wheel. Another pierced a housing panel. A third ricocheted underground and erupted beneath the tank like a buried ember coming alive. The Tiger staggered, its turret jerked. Smoke curled from vents. It wasn't a clean kill. It was something far stranger. The slow unraveling of a machine built to be unstoppable. But there was no time for wonder. Another Tiger pushed forward to take the lead. This one fired at point-blank range. The shell screamed toward the ridge. Men threw themselves to the ground. It slammed into a boulder a few meters to Mercer's right, vaporizing it into a storm of stone splinters that sliced through coats and skin. Mercer shielded his face, feeling sharp fragments sting his cheek. Someone cried out behind him. Thompson fired back. The Canadian round struck the Tiger's turret cheek. It did not penetrate, but the warped detonation sent cracks spiderwebbing along a weld seam. Steam vented from the joint. The turret rotation faltered, grinding like metal chewing on metal. A second shot followed. The Tiger shuddered. A third. The tank slowed. The cold air thickened with smoke and the strange burnt metal scent of the alloy's uneven reactions. The engineers stared, their breath caught in their throats. Rowe clutched one of the empty casings, turning it as though he had never seen such a thing before, even though he had personally signed off on its transport. The third Tiger emerged from the fog. This one moved faster, more aggressive, more determined. It fired twice in rapid succession, shells plowing into the earth and sending men scrambling in panic. Mercer threw his weight against the gun's frame to steady it, as the ground shook with the concussive blasts. Thompson's face was soaked in sweat despite the cold. His movements had become precise, mechanical, the repetition of survival. McKinley loaded another round. Thompson fired. The shell hit the Tiger's track assembly. A distorted blast blossomed across the metal in a crescent of uneven sparks. The detonated alloy sheared several guide horns and embedded molten fragments into the track links. The Tiger lurched violently, one tread locking in place. Forrest slammed a new round into Thompson's hands. Again, the second shot hit the side armor near the intake grate. This time the detonation drove fragments inward, forcing heated slivers of metal into the tank's cooling system. Flames burped from a side panel. The Tiger roared like an animal struck in the throat. The engineers watched, stunned. The infantrymen stared, forgetting the cold for a moment. Somewhere beneath the chaos, a realization was taking root. These cheap Canadian rounds were not failing. They were destabilizing the internal workings of the Tigers in ways no one could have predicted. Another tank fell silent. Its engine choked to a stop. Another. Smoke covered the hillside like drifting curtains. The fog, once a shield for the approaching armor, now carried the scent of their defeat. McKinley counted shells under his breath. Thompson wiped his forehead. Mercer steadied the gun as it was repositioned. No one dared to speak aloud what they all felt tightening in the air. Something was shifting, not just in the battle, but in their understanding of what this strange, underrated ammunition could do. And somewhere beyond the fog, the Germans were realizing it too. The fog settled thicker after the fourth Tiger went silent, as if the valley itself were trying to hide what had just happened. A strange quiet washed over the ridge, not peace, but a hollowed-out stillness that comes only after machines of war stop moving. The German advance had not ceased entirely, yet the sounds of their armor had changed. The confident growl of engines was replaced with hesitant revs, cautious adjustments, the metallic clatter of treads grinding more slowly, as the crews realized something was wrong, something they had never trained for. Corporal Alan Mercer wiped the grit from his face, still breathing hard. The smoke drifting from the wrecked tanks mixed with the fog, forming gray pillars that reached up toward the blank winter sky. The ground remained cold enough that every footstep left a crisp, temporary print in the frost. Mercer could feel the tremor in his fingers, not from fear now, but from the sheer intensity of what they had endured. Behind him, Lieutenant Rowe crouched beside a spent casing, examining its warped seams with the fascination of a surgeon discovering a new pathology. His glasses were splattered with mud, and his gloves were torn at the fingertips, exposing skin reddened by cold. He ran his thumb along the uneven metal of the casing's fractured edge, tracing the pattern created by the alloy's unpredictable burn. This wasn't luck, he muttered quietly, almost to himself. McKinley and Thompson were too exhausted to answer. Both men leaned on the frame of the 6-pounder gun, chests heaving, shoulders tight. Thompson's forehead glistened with sweat despite the frigid air. McKinley's hands trembled as he tried to wipe oil from his palms onto his coat. Mercer took a slow breath. He could hear the faint rattle of German infantry moving behind the crippled tanks, their boots crunching frost, their muffled voices uncertain. The armor that had once shielded them was now a line of broken silhouettes emerging faintly through the haze. One Tiger still smoldered, flames flickering from a cracked panel like the dying light of a lantern. Forrest, the sergeant, spat into the mud and checked the horizon. "They'll regroup," he said. "They have to." He wasn't wrong. The Germans were disciplined, relentless, and adaptive. Defeat was not accepted easily, especially not by armored crews who believed themselves invincible. A distant call echoed through the valley, muffled by fog. Mercer couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The Germans were organizing. They were repositioning, shifting to a flanking angle, preparing to test the ridge again. The Canadians braced themselves instinctively, but something else was changing. Mercer felt it before he understood it. A subtle shift in the air, a pressure building at the base of his skull. The fog began to swirl differently, carried by a breeze that whispered through the pines. The cold deepened, sharpening every sound. The ridge felt suddenly exposed again, its earlier triumph fading into the stark reality of the mountain terrain. Rowe finally stood up, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. "These rounds," he whispered, still staring at the casing. "The alloy. It fractures unpredictably. The Germans think it's cheap, but the structure destabilizes under impact in a way steel can't predict." Thompson let out a humorless laugh. "So the shells are defective?" "No," Rowe said. "They're volatile." It wasn't a word anyone found comforting. A low rumble echoed again from below. The 5th Tiger emerged at last. Massive, intact, unscarred. Its turret swung with slow precision. This crew had learned from the others' mistakes. They advanced cautiously, angling their armor, moving in short bursts that minimized exposure. The tank commander must have been shouting orders inside, calibrating every approach with meticulous care. Forrest growled. "This one's smarter." As if answering him, the Tiger fired. A single brutal shot. The shell punched into the ridge just meters to the left of the 6-pounder, tearing open the earth in a roar of fractured stone and splintered frost. Mercer felt the shockwave slam against his chest, knocking him sideways. Dirt showered down on them. A pine trunk cracked and toppled behind their position. McKinley scrambled back to the crates. "3 rounds left," he shouted. "Make them count." Forrest snapped. Mercer steadied the gun with his shoulder. Thompson aimed. The fog shifted again, revealing the Tiger's outline, its armor gleaming with moisture, its engine rumbling with a deep, predatory rhythm. Fire! The shot streaked through the air, slicing the fog in a glowing arc. It struck the Tiger's side plate with a distorted burst of sparks. Heat washed across the metal, but the tank kept moving. The crew had angled the hull just enough to deflect the worst of it. The second round followed quickly. This one detonated against the intake vent, showering blazing fragments that clattered against the armor like hot rain. But the Tiger pushed forward relentless, learning, adapting. Thompson exhaled shakily as McKinley loaded the final shell. "This is it," McKinley said, voice unsteady. No one responded. The Tiger began to climb the ridge, its treads digging deep, its turret zeroing in on the 6-pounder. Mercer could see the faint outline of the gunner through the fog-shrouded viewport. The tank was close enough now that the smell of diesel drifted toward them. Thompson steadied the gun. Forrest braced the rear support. McKinley held his breath. "Fire!" The last Canadian round shot forward with a metallic scream. It struck just beneath the Tiger's turret ring, the same cursed weak point that mechanical manuals insisted was almost impossible to exploit under combat conditions. The shell's alloy core fractured instantly, erupting in that strange, blistering bloom that engineers still didn't fully understand. Shards of heated metal ripped outward and inward simultaneously, infiltrating the narrow seam where the turret met the hull. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Tiger lurched violently. The turret froze mid-rotation. A plume of smoke shot from the vent. The engine coughed, sputtered, and choked itself into silence. The ridge vibrated with the groan of failing machinery. Inside the tank, men shouted, muffled, frantic, panicked. Someone pounded against a hatch. Flames flickered through a seam. The Tiger rolled backward half a meter before settling into the mud with a heavy, final exhale of steam. Silence fell again. The fifth Tiger was dead. The Canadians stared, breathless, mud-splattered, trembling. Mercer felt the shock settle into his bones like cold sinking into wood. They had run out of ammunition. They had no reserves. If another tank emerged from the fog, there would be nothing left to fight with but rifles and desperation. But no more Tigers came. The fog swallowed the valley in thick, motionless stillness. The German infantry pulled back, their silhouettes fading into the gray. Even the echo of engines retreated, replaced by the soft hiss of drifting smoke. McKinley collapsed onto the mud, laughing and crying at the same time. Thompson leaned against the gun, eyes closed. Forrest sank to one knee, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Rowe held the empty casing like a relic. Mercer watched the fog shift around the silent giants on the slope. 5 Tigers, the pride of the German armored corps, reduced to motionless monuments by ammunition no one had believed in. But the ridge felt heavier now. The silence was not victory. It was the beginning of understanding. The fog began to thin only after the sun had climbed high enough for its pale winter light to bleed across the ridge. It revealed a landscape transformed by violence. Churned earth, shattered pines, and the looming carcasses of 5 Tiger tanks standing like rusted monuments to a battle no one expected the Canadians to survive. The smoke rising from their ruptured seams curled into the air with lazy indifference, carrying the faint smell of burning oil and scorched metal. Corporal Alan Mercer stood amid the wreckage with his rifle hanging loosely at his side, watching as the world slowly came back into focus. The engineers approached the disabled Tigers with a mixture of caution and awe. Rowe walked ahead of them, holding that single warped casing between his fingers as though it were a fragile artifact pulled from an archaeological dig. The closer he came to the first tank, the more the silence deepened. The ground felt soft beneath their boots, the frost thawing under the steady creep of daylight. Thin columns of steam rose from the exposed engine panels. The steel hulls radiated the last breaths of their mechanical fury. Inside one of the tanks, the hatch hung open. A helmet lay half buried in the mud beside it, its leather lining charred at the edges. The crew had fled or died in the smoke. Mercer didn't know which possibility unsettled him more. He crouched beside the tank's side plate, fingertips brushing the surface. The metal was warm. Beneath the warmth, he felt a faint vibration. Not movement, but memory. The echo of the immense power this machine had carried moments before its fall. Thompson and McKinley approached quietly, their exhaustion settling into a contemplative stillness. Forrest joined them a moment later, scanning the tank with the wary eyes of someone expecting it to wake up again. There was no pride in their expressions, only bewilderment, tempered by the sober weight that follows survival bought at the edge of failure. Rowe examined the damaged turret ring. The alloy fragments had fused with the steel, embedding themselves like splinters of a broken star. He traced the seam with his gloved finger, shaking his head slowly. "They'll never believe this," he said. Forrest snorted. "Hell, I barely believe it." McKinley nudged the ground with his boot. revealing a fragment of the Canadian round lodged in the mud, twisted, burned, unrecognizable. The Germans laughed at this stuff, he whispered. Mercer looked at the crippled tanks and at the fog drifting silently between them. Not anymore. A crow landed atop the nearest Tiger, its wings flapping once before it settled, black against the dull gray of the armor. It tilted its head as if inspecting the machine, then released a low caw that carried eerily across the ridge. Mercer watched it for a moment. The bird didn't move. It simply sat there, perched on the fallen giant, indifferent to the battles of men. The quiet that followed was heavier than the roar of gunfire had been. It stretched across the ridge, seeping into the lungs of every man standing there. They were alive, but the weight of what they had witnessed pressed down on them like the cold itself. None of them felt triumphant. If anything, the scene felt like a funeral, not for the tank crews, not even for the machines, but for the illusions surrounding them. The German Tigers had been mythic, implacable, symbols of unstoppable force. Now they sat shattered beneath the winter sky, and the Canadians had destroyed them using ammunition considered inferior, even by their own supply officers. Mercer stepped back, letting the engineers circle the tank. He walked a few meters away, stopping at a ridge of broken earth where their last shot had landed its fatal blow. From this vantage point, he could see the entire field, the fog drifting in low waves, the crippled armor rising like islands through the gray, the faint silhouettes of the retreating German infantry disappearing into the tree line. He felt the cold wind brush against his face, carrying with it the smell of pine and burning fuel. The sky above was a pale, exhausted blue. The world looked quiet, humbled, as though the mountain itself had witnessed something it wasn't meant to see. Thompson joined him, his breath rising in slow clouds. "Do you think they'll send more?" he asked. Mercer didn't answer right away. He looked at the valley, at the broken machines, at the long shadows stretching over the frost. Eventually, he shook his head. "I think today was enough." Thompson nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. War had conditioned them to expect the worst. But for now, the silence held. Far behind them, the sound of trucks approached. Canadian reinforcements, supply wagons, medics. The ridge began to fill with new voices, new footsteps, new hands touching the still warm armor. Officers murmured to one another in clipped tones. Engineers pointed to the twisted seams where the alloy had done its strange work. The legend of what had happened here was already taking shape, though none of the men who had lived it felt like heroes. Mercer stepped away from the crowd and approached the 5th Tiger, the last to fall. Its turret was frozen at an awkward angle, pointing toward the sky as though asking a question no one could answer. A thin stream of smoke drifted from the cracked seam around the turret ring. He placed his palm gently against the cold metal, feeling the faint residual warmth beneath the surface. The tank loomed above him, immense even in defeat. He lowered his hand, took a breath, and turned away. As he walked back toward the Canadian line, the fog lifted one final time, revealing the full shape of the ridge, scarred, silent, littered with the wreckage of a victory that felt too heavy to celebrate. In the years that followed, historians would debate this moment. Officers would credit tactics. Engineers would revise manuals. German veterans would speak of an alloy anomaly with bitterness or disbelief. But Mercer never told the story with bravado. Whenever he remembered that morning, he pictured the fog, the silence, and his hand resting on the broken metal of a tiger that should never have died. And that image, cold, still, and unsentimental, was enough.